The Wyoming wind howled across the charred remains of the Whitmore homestead, like a demon unleashed from hell, carrying with it the acrid smell of ash and the bitter promise of winter's cruel embrace. October 1877 had painted the high plains in shades of amber and rust. But beneath the deceptive beauty lay the harsh reality of frontier survival, where death rode closer than a man's own shadow. Clara Elizabeth Whitmore pressed her trembling 8-year-old body deeper into the blackened skeleton of what had once been her father's workshop. Her small hands raw and bleeding as she clawed desperately at the frozen earth beneath the collapsed fence post. The blue calico dress she wore, torn and stained from 3 weeks of desperate survival in the wilderness, hung loose on her thin frame like a burial shroud. Her bare feet, cut by countless miles across rocky ground, had gone numb hours ago. But still she dug with the frantic determination of someone who knew that salvation lay buried in the unforgiving soil. "I know you're skulking in there like some mangy coyote, girl." Jonas Riggs' voice cut through the evening air with the lazy menace of a coiled rattlesnake. His words carried the promise of unspeakable violence, each syllable dripping with anticipated cruelty. "Come on out with your hands showing, and maybe I won't blow that stubborn little head clean off your shoulders." Clara's breath came in sharp, visible puffs in the frigid air as terror gnawed at her stomach like persistent hunger. 21 days had passed since her mother Ruth's agonizing death from fever, 21 days of hiding in root cellars and abandoned line shacks while men like Jonas hunted her across the Wyoming territory, with the relentless determination of wolves following a blood trail across endless prairie. The sound of boots crunching through broken glass and scattered debris told Clara that Jonas had brought substantial help, at least 4 men, maybe more, all armed with modern rifles, and motivated by the enormous bounty Calvin Riggs had placed on her capture. Dead or alive, the reward posters specified, though Clara suspected with a child's intuitive understanding of evil that Calvin preferred her breathing long enough to discover what other evidence might exist beyond what she sought now. Another rifle shot cracked across the homestead ruins, this one close enough that she could smell the acrid powder smoke drifting on the restless wind. Splinters of charred wood exploded inches from her pale cheek, and she bit down hard on her lower lip to stifle the scream that clawed at her throat. Slippery little snakes got more hiding spots than a prairie dog warren. Jonas cursed with language that would have earned him a horsewhipping from any decent woman in the territory. "Spread out, boys, she can't have gone far on them bare feet, bleeding all over creation like a stuck pig." Fear and desperation drove Clara to abandon any thought of further concealment. She focused entirely on the task at hand, digging frantically at the spot where she and her father had buried his most precious possession 3 weeks before his death. The journal had to be here. Thomas Whitmore had promised it would be safe beneath this very post, protected by oiled cloth and wrapped in prayers for justice. Her small fingers, already raw from weeks of scavenging for survival, found the edge of something hard and rectangular buried in the earth. Hope flared in her chest like a struck match as she worked to free the package from its hiding place. That was precisely when she heard the whisper of moccasins on stone and looked up to see an elderly Lakota warrior emerge from the evening shadows like a spirit given flesh and bone. The man moved with the fluid grace of a hunting mountain cat, his weathered face marked by deep scars that spoke of battles fought with courage and lost with honor. 2 eagle feathers adorned his graying braids, their tips moving gently in the restless wind, like prayers offered to ancient spirits. His buckskin shirt and leggings bore intricate beadwork that had faded with age and hard travel, while his dark eyes held the steady calm of someone who had made peace with death and no longer feared its cold embrace. "War, washte hoksila chingsa," he murmured in the melodic language of the Lakota, then switched to careful English learned long ago at a mission school. "Be still, young warrior. They hunt with ears more than eyes in this gathering darkness." Clara wanted desperately to speak, to explain about the journal, and begged this unexpected stranger for help, but the old warrior raised a gnarled finger to his lips. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her and began digging with hands that bore the calluses of 60 winters on the Great Plains. Together, they worked in desperate silence, while Jonas Riggs and his hired killers spread through the homestead ruins like a pack of wolves closing for the kill. Their voices carried clearly on the thin mountain air as they coordinated their search with military precision. The warrior's scarred fingers found the buried leather packet at exactly the moment that hoofbeats began to thunder across the hard-pan soil with the rhythm of approaching doom. 6 riders materialized from the gathering dusk at full gallop, their weapons gleaming dully in the dying light. "Help me dig it up," Clara whispered urgently, her young voice barely audible above the wind's mournful song. "Please, mister, it has to be here. Papa said the truth was buried here, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it back to light." The old warrior's fingers closed around the journal as bullets began to whine through the air above their heads, like angry hornets seeking flesh. Without the slightest hesitation, he lifted Clara onto his paint mare Windwalker, a sturdy horse whose intelligent eyes and alert ears spoke of countless miles traveled through dangerous country. "Hold tight to that book waist, Wing Yang," he said, using the Lakota words for brave woman, as he swung up behind her with surprising agility for his age. "Grip it as if your very life flows through its pages, because in sacred truth, it does." Windwalker leaped forward with explosive power, her hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground as bullets began to crack and whine through the space they had occupied just heartbeats before. Clara felt the wind of lead passing close enough to part her hair as her rescuer guided the mare with consummate skill, using every scrap of cover the landscape provided, while their enemies' muzzle flashes lit up the gathering darkness like deadly fireflies. Behind them, Jonas Riggs' voice rose in a howl of frustrated rage that echoed across the empty plains like the cry of a damned soul. "After them, you worthless dogs, $100 in gold to the man who brings me that girl's pretty little scalp." But Windwalker was already carrying them into the vast Wyoming night, where shadows offered sanctuary, and the promise of justice rode on the shoulders of an unlikely partnership between a grieving child and a warrior whose own quest for truth was just beginning to unfold. As Windwalker carried them across the moonlit prairie at a steady lope that ate up ground without exhausting the mare, Clara felt the weight of her father's journal pressed against her chest, pages filled with Thomas Whitmore's careful handwriting, documenting crimes that powerful men would commit murder to keep buried in unmarked graves. "What's your name?" she asked during their first brief rest beside a mountain stream, her young voice still steady despite everything she had endured. "I am called Tokala," the warrior replied, offering her water from a leather pouch while keeping watchful eyes on their back trail. "It means fox in the language of my people, a fitting name for one who must be clever and swift to survive in a world that shows little mercy to the unwary. I'm Clara Elizabeth Whitmore." She studied his scarred features in the starlight, noting the way his eyes held shadows of old pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "Why did you help me back there? You don't even know me." Tokala's weathered face softened slightly as he looked at this brave child who had endured more hardship than most adults. "Sometimes the spirits guide us where we need to be, little one. Perhaps we are meant to help each other on paths that neither of us can walk alone." They rode through the night toward Crow's Landing, a rough frontier settlement, where Clara hoped to find temporary sanctuary. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, she began to tell him about her family, about Thomas, who had worked as a miner at the Red Knife operation until his death in what officials called a tragic but inevitable accident, and about Ruth, who had succumbed to fever just 1 month ago, leaving Clara completely alone in a harsh world. Papa wasn't just any miner. Clara explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of her father's courage. He noticed things that weren't right at the mine. Bad things. Dangerous things that had nothing to do with cave-ins or gas explosions. He said powerful men were doing terrible things to people who couldn't fight back. Someone needed to write it all down so the truth wouldn't die with the victims. She showed him the journal, its leather cover water-stained and partially fire-damaged. Many pages were illegible, crucial names and dates lost to the elements and deliberate destruction. But enough remained to tell a story of systematic corruption and murder. Clara listened without judgment, his expression growing darker as Clara spoke. He had his own reasons for being in this particular country, though he didn't yet share them with his young companion. The war that had ended earlier that year had taken everything from him. His village destroyed his wife, killed in a cavalry attack. His son vanished without trace in the final chaotic battles. Now he wandered like a lost spirit, following whispers and rumors that might lead him to answers about his boy's fate, or at least to the peace that comes with knowing the truth. Crow's Landing appeared with the rising sun, a collection of rough buildings housing miners, railroad workers, gamblers, and those who profited from their labor. The settlement clung to existence in the shadow of the mountains, like a tick on a dog's back, sustained by the steady flow of men seeking fortune in the earth's reluctant embrace. Clara led Clara to the boarding house, run by Mary Halstead, a kind-faced woman in her early 30s, whose eyes lit with unmistakable relief at seeing the child alive and relatively unharmed. "Clara, thank the Lord you're safe." Mary knelt to embrace her, genuine tears streaming down her cheeks. Her gaze moved uncertainly to Clara, taking in his war-painted features and traditional dress with the wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious of strangers. "This gentleman he saved me from Jonas Riggs and his men." Clara said simply, her tone carrying an adult certainty about the character of those who had proven themselves through actions rather than words. Mary's expression tightened visibly at the mention of that name, fear flickering across her features before she quickly suppressed it. She invited them both inside, offering food and temporary shelter, while casting worried glances toward the street where curious onlookers had begun to gather. In the boarding house's modest dining room, they encountered Deputy Elias Crane, a young lawman in his early 20s, whose crisp uniform couldn't quite hide the uncertainty that seemed to follow him like a persistent shadow. His badge gleamed with recent polishing, but his eyes held the troubled look of someone wrestling with conflicting loyalties. "Miss Clara Sarks," Crane said carefully, his voice carrying the formal tone of official business. "We've been searching for you since your mother's passing. There are folks in the territory concerned about your welfare and proper guardianship." "Worried I might start talking about things they'd rather keep buried, you mean?" Clara replied with startling directness that made the deputy's face flush red with embarrassment. Mary quickly intervened before the conversation could become more uncomfortable. "She's been through quite enough already, Elias. Let her rest and recover before we discuss her future arrangements." After Crane departed with obvious reluctance, Mary examined the fire-damaged journal with growing alarm. Her face grew pale as she tried to decipher the water-stained entries, many of which were completely illegible due to deliberate destruction. Too many crucial pages are ruined. She murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Names of witnesses, specific dates, detailed evidence. What's left here isn't nearly enough to bring down Calvin Riggs and his organization on its own, even if we could find someone brave enough to listen." "Who exactly is Calvin Riggs?" Clara asked, noting the way Mary's hands trembled slightly as she spoke the name. "Jonas's older brother and the real power behind the Red Knife Mine." Mary explained, glancing nervously toward the windows, as if afraid of being overheard. "He owns judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, anyone whose cooperation is necessary to maintain his grip on this part of Wyoming. Your father mentioned someone in his letters, a former miner who managed to escape before they could silence him permanently." She slipped Clara a small piece of paper torn from a ledger book. Written on it, in Mary's careful script, was a name Patrick Murphy and a location Bitter Creek Railroad Camp, approximately 50 miles northeast of Crow's Landing. Clara's heart began to race with new hope. "You think this man might still be alive?" "It's possible," Mary said cautiously. "But finding him would mean leaving the relative safety of town and venturing back into country where Riggs's men hunt freely. It would be incredibly dangerous, especially for a child." Clara looked at Tokala, seeing her own determination reflected in his dark eyes. They both understood what was at stake. Without corroborating testimony from a living witness, her father's journal would likely be dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled employee, and Calvin Riggs would continue his reign of terror unchallenged. "We have to try," Clara said finally. "Papa died trying to gather this evidence. I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless." Tokala nodded grimly, recognizing the kind of courage that had nothing to do with age or size. "Then we ride at first light, little fox. Justice delayed too long becomes justice denied." Inciting Incident 1, 300 words. That night, Clara sat by lamplight in Mary's boarding house, carefully studying each surviving page of her father's journal, while Tokala maintained watch from the front porch. The document that represented their only hope for justice was a patchwork of legible entries and fire-damaged fragments, many crucial details lost forever to the flames that had consumed much of the Whitmore homestead. What she could read painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached from the mine shafts to the territorial capital. Thomas Whitmore had been methodical in his documentation, recording dates and witness accounts, with the precision of a man who understood that lives might depend on the accuracy of his information. September 12, 1877. Observed Jonas Riggs personally supervising the disposal of mining equipment in Shaft 7. Equipment bore fresh blood stains and appeared to have been used as weapons rather than tools. When questioned by Murphy about the stains, Riggs claimed they resulted from a workplace accident that required no official report. September 20th, 1877. Murphy discovered human remains in the sealed section of Shaft 7 during unauthorized exploration. Remains showed evidence of violent death rather than mining accidents. Murphy believes at least 12 individuals may have been murdered and disposed of in this manner. We must find more evidence before approaching authorities. But the most disturbing entries dealt with something far darker than simple murder for profit. Thomas had documented the systematic use of Lakota prisoners as forced labor men who had officially died in the war's final battles, but who continued to toil in conditions that made slavery seem merciful by comparison. October 1st, 1877. Witnessed the arrival of 6 native prisoners, all bearing fresh wounds consistent with recent capture. Calvin Riggs personally oversaw their assignment to the deepest and most dangerous sections of the mine. These men have no legal existence officially. They died in battle weeks ago. Who will speak for them if they disappear? Many of the names mentioned in these entries were illegible due to water damage, but one section remained clear enough to read. The young warrior they call Mahpia shows natural leadership among the prisoners. He has been organizing them to resist the worst abuses, sharing what little food they can obtain, and maintaining their spiritual practices despite prohibition. I fear this courage will mark him for special attention from Jonas Riggs. Clara found herself wondering about this Mahpia, whose name meant cloud, in the beautiful language she had heard Tokala speak. Had he survived the horrors Thomas described? Or had his courage ultimately cost him his life, like so many others who had dared to resist Calvin Riggs' brutality? The final legible entry in her father's journal was dated just 2 days before his death, October 15th, 1877. Patrick Murphy has agreed to testify about what we have witnessed, but he plans to leave the territory immediately afterward. He fears for his life and the lives of his family members. I have given him directions to a safe house operated by Friends of the Underground Railroad. If anything happens to me, Clara must find Murphy and ensure his testimony reaches honest authorities. The truth must not die with us. Clara closed the journal with trembling hands, understanding now why her father had been so insistent about its hiding place. This wasn't just evidence of crime, it was a sacred trust, a responsibility passed from father to daughter, across the divide between life and death. "We leave before dawn," she told Tokala when he came inside. "Patrick Murphy might be our only chance to make people believe what Papa wrote in this book." Tokala nodded gravely. "Then we will find this Murphy and hear his story. But we must be prepared for the possibility that Calvin Riggs has already silenced him permanently." They departed Crow's Landing in the pre-dawn darkness, following the railroad tracks toward Bitter Creek, while Mary Halstead watched from her window with tears streaming down her face. She had given them supplies and directions, but her parting words carried ominous weight. "Be careful, child. Riggs has eyes and ears everywhere in this territory. Trust no one completely, not even those who claim to want to help." The landscape grew progressively rougher as they traveled northeast, broken badlands, where a man could disappear without trace and questions would go unasked. Clara rode behind Tokala, on Windwalker, the journal secure in an oiled pouch that protected it from the elements while keeping it close to her heart. They were perhaps 15 miles from Crow's Landing when dust clouds appeared on the horizon behind them, multiple riders moving at speed, too many and too purposeful to be casual travelers or legitimate lawmen. "Jonas has found our trail already," Tokala observed with grim satisfaction rather than fear. "Your friend Crane may have sent word of our departure willingly or otherwise." The chase that followed tested both Windwalker's endurance and Tokala's knowledge of the terrain. The old warrior guided them through arroyos and across rocky ground that would be difficult to track, but their pursuers proved remarkably persistent and well-informed about the country they traversed. The pursuit led them toward the Powder River, its banks lined with cottonwoods that offered potential concealment. But as they approached, the water gunfire erupted from the trees ahead, a carefully planned ambush designed to catch them in a deadly crossfire, with no avenue of escape. "Down!" Tokala shouted, pulling Clara low against Windwalker's neck as bullets whined overhead like angry wasps. He guided the mare into the shallows, using the riverbank's limited cover, while returning fire with his Spencer rifle. His first shot dropped one of their attackers from his horse with the precision of long practice. His second forced the others to seek better protection among the trees. But Jonas Riggs was no amateur when it came to violence and tactical planning. He had positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire, while leaving himself room to maneuver for a flanking attack. A bullet clipped Tokala's left thigh, sending dark blood flowing down his buckskin pants and weakening his ability to control their mount. "You're hurt," Clara cried, pressing her small hands against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Or just a scratched little fox." Tokala replied through gritted teeth, though they both knew it was considerably more serious than he pretended. "Stay low and hold tight to that journal." With grim determination born of desperation, he began a fighting retreat downstream, using every fold of ground and stand of timber for concealment, while Clara did her best to tend his wound with strips torn from her already tattered dress. They escaped the immediate trap through a combination of Tokala's tactical skill and sheer luck, but at a terrible cost. The old warrior's injury would slow their progress significantly, making them vulnerable to renewed pursuit while limiting their options for finding sanctuary. Meanwhile, Deputy Elias Crane had ridden out to the burned Whitmore homestead, drawn by his own growing doubts about the official story of Thomas's death, and the mounting evidence that something far more sinister than mining accidents was occurring in his jurisdiction. Among the ashes and debris, he found Clara's abandoned rag doll, and something that stopped his heart, a mining pick, with initials carved deep into its wooden handle. PM. Patrick Murphy, his own cousin, who had supposedly died in a cave-in 6 months earlier. leaving behind a widow and 3 small children. The sight of that tool, clearly taken as a trophy or memento by someone who had been present at Murphy's death, planted the first seeds of real doubt in Crane's mind about his own complicity in the corruption that was destroying his community from within. The Bitter Creek Railroad camp sprawled along the tracks, like a temporary city built from canvas, an ambition filled with Irish and Chinese workers blasting a path through the mountain granite, while a small army of support personnel kept them fed, supplied, and relatively sober. The sound of dynamite explosions echoed through the valleys like distant thunder, accompanied by the ring of hammers on steel and the constant chatter of men working in a dozen different languages. Clara and Tokala approached the camp cautiously in the early morning light, the old warrior's wound bandaged with strips from Clara's dress, but still seeping blood that attracted flies and sapped his strength with each passing hour. They had spent the night in a shallow cave, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested fitfully, both knowing that Jonas Riggs and his men would not be far behind. Finding Patrick Murphy among the hundreds of workers proved easier than expected, and the Irish foreman they approached immediately recognized the name and pointed toward a cluster of tents at the camp's eastern edge. Pat Murphy, he's here, but he's not the same man who came to us 3 months ago," the foreman warned with genuine concern in his voice. "Something's got him spooked worse than I've ever seen. Jumps at shadows, he does, and won't talk about what happened at that mine of his." They found Murphy sitting outside a patched canvas shelter, methodically sharpening a knife, while his eyes constantly scanned the surrounding area for potential threats. He was a man in his 30s, built like the coal miner he had once been, but his face bore the haunted expression of someone who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. When Clara showed him the journal, Murphy's weathered features went white as fresh snow. "Sweet Jesus in heaven," he whispered, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. "I thought all evidence of that hellish place had been destroyed, along with everyone who knew its secrets." "You're alive," Clara said simply. "Papa wrote that you escaped before they could silence you. Will you tell people what you saw? Will you help us make them pay for what they did?" Murphy's hands trembled as he opened the journal and began reading Thomas Whitmore's careful documentation. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he recognized names and dates that corresponded to his own memories of systematic murder and brutal oppression. "Your father was a brave man, little one. Braver than I could ever hope to be." He looked up from the journal with eyes full of self-recrimination. "I should have stayed and fought beside him instead of running like a coward when things got dangerous." But before Murphy could provide the detailed testimony they desperately needed, shouts erupted from the camp's western entrance. Jonas Riggs and his remaining men had arrived, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding, but their weapons ready for immediate use. The railroad foreman approached Jonas with the deference of someone who understood the political realities of territorial life. "What can we do for you, Mr. Riggs?" "Looking for a runaway child and the Indian who kidnapped her." Jonas replied smoothly, producing an official-looking warrant that was probably forged, but carried enough legal terminology to impress unsophisticated men. "They're armed and dangerous. Anyone who helps us apprehend them will be well compensated." Murphy grabbed Clara and Tokala by their arms, his fear overriding any thoughts of heroic resistance. "This way, quickly. There's a freight train preparing to depart. It's our only chance of escape." They ran toward the railroad siding, where a long string of boxcars was being prepared for the journey east. The locomotive's steam whistle shrieked warnings as workers made final preparations for departure, creating enough noise and confusion to mask their desperate flight. "Under the cars," Murphy shouted over the industrial cacophony. "It's the only way they won't spot us." Clara found herself crawling beneath a moving boxcar as the train began to build speed and the massive wheels thundering just inches above her head, while sparks flew and smoke choked her lungs. The experience was absolutely terrifying. One slip or moment of inattention would result in instant death beneath tons of moving steel. For 20 minutes, that felt like hours, They clung desperately to the train's undercarriage as it wound through mountain passes and across trestle bridges that spanned dizzying gorges. Clara's arms ached from holding her weight, and she could feel her grip weakening as exhaustion and fear took their toll. When the train finally slowed for a water stop at a remote depot, they dropped off into brush beside the tracks, battered and filthy, but miraculously alive. Murphy was waiting with horses he had somehow acquired during their mechanical flight. Clara never learned how he had managed this feat, but frontier men often possessed skills that city dwellers could barely comprehend. "There's an old silver mine about 10 miles north of here," Murphy explained as they mounted up. "Played out years ago, but it's got good water and hiding places that would take an army to search properly. We can rest there while I tell you everything I witnessed at Red Knife." The abandoned Celestial Mine was indeed a perfect refuge, a complex of collapsed buildings and flooded tunnels surrounded by equipment too worthless to steal and too heavy to move. In the depths of the main shaft, Murphy finally began to tell his story. Calvin Riggs wasn't content with simple fraud and theft. He said, his voice echoing off stone walls. He discovered that native prisoners could provide labor that cost nothing and left no legal complications if they died from overwork or abuse. Officially, these men had already been killed in battle, who would investigate their deaths a second time. Clara pressed him for specific names, dates, and details that could corroborate her father's journal. Murphy provided them readily, his memory sharp, when it came to documenting the horrors he had witnessed. There was one young brave who stood out from the others, called himself Mahpia, which means cloud in their tongue. Natural leader, that one. He organized the others to resist the worst abuses, shared what little food they could obtain, and maintained their spirits with prayers and songs from their homeland. Takala's face remained impassive, but Clara noticed his hands tighten into fists at the mention of that name. She filed the observation away for later consideration, while continuing to press Murphy for details. But their conversation was interrupted by the acrid smell of smoke drifting down from the surface. Jonas had found them again, and was employing the time-honored tactic of burning out his enemies. The old mine became a furnace as dried timber supports caught fire and began collapsing in cascades of sparks and burning debris. They fled through tunnels that seemed to stretch forever, while smoke choked their lungs and flames licked at their heels like pursuing demons. Clara clutched her father's journal as burning timbers crashed around them. But despite her best efforts, several more crucial pages were lost to the spreading fire. They emerged through an old ventilation shaft into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the smoky darkness below. Murphy was gone. Whether killed in the fire overcome by smoke or simply fled in panic, they couldn't determine. But his testimony, brief as it had been, had provided crucial corroborating evidence for the journal's accusations. More importantly, Clara had noticed Tokala's reaction to the name Mahpia. There was a connection there, something personal that went beyond simple sympathy for the oppressed. She would need to explore that connection when they found a safe place to rest and recover from their latest brush with death. High in the mountain country above the tree line, where the wind carried the bite of early winter and the stars seemed close enough to touch, Clara and Tokala found temporary refuge in a cave that offered protection from both the elements and their relentless pursuers. The old warrior's wounded leg had stiffened during their escape from the burning mine, and Clara could see that infection was beginning to set in, despite her best efforts to keep the wound clean. That night, by the flickering light of a small fire built from scraps of wood and dried grass, Tokala finally began to read Thomas Whitmore's journal with the careful attention it deserved. His English learned decades ago at a mission school was adequate for deciphering the careful script and technical terminology that filled the surviving pages. Clara watched his weathered face as he read, noting the way his expression grew progressively darker with each revelation of systematic corruption and murder. When he reached the sections dealing with native prisoners, his jaw clenched visibly, and she saw his hands tremble with suppressed emotion. Then he found the entry that changed everything between them. on the detailed account of a young Lakota warrior's murder at the hands of Jonas Riggs. As Tokala read the description of Mahpia's courage in the face of death, tears began to track down his scarred cheeks, and Clara realized with shock that she was witnessing the complete breakdown of a man who had endured more loss than any human being should be asked to bear. Mahpia. He whispered the name falling from his lips like both a prayer and a curse. My son, my only child, my bright star who was to carry our people's hopes into the future. The journal slipped from his trembling hands as the full weight of Thomas Whitmore's testimony hit home. For nearly a year, Tokala had believed his boy died honorably in battle cut down while fighting for their homeland and their way of life. The truth was infinitely worse. Mahpia had died in chains, like an animal murdered for the crime of trying to protect fellow prisoners from further brutality. Clara felt her own eyes fill with tears as she watched this proud warrior's heart break before her eyes. Without conscious thought, she moved to his side and took his scarred hand in both of her small ones. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, offering the only comfort she possessed. "Papa wrote that your son was brave, that he stood up for what was right, even when it meant terrible danger. That sounds like the kind of man any father would be proud to call his son." Tokala nodded slowly, struggling to regain the emotional control that had sustained him through countless hardships. When he looked at Clara again, his dark eyes held a new hardness that spoke of irrevocable decisions and deadly intentions. "This is no longer just about seeking justice for your father's murder, little fox," he said with quiet certainty that carried more menace than any shouted threat. "Calvin Riggs will answer for my son's death. This I swear by the sacred pipe and the bones of my ancestors." Something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Clara was no longer just a child he had agreed to protect out of compassion and duty. She was his partner in a quest for justice that had become deeply personal for both of them. They shared the bond of children whose parents had been murdered by the same men, united by grief and the determination to ensure that such crimes would not go unpunished. Their mountain sanctuary could not last indefinitely. Jonas Riggs was a skilled tracker with unlimited resources and the kind of obsessive determination that comes from serving a brother who tolerates no failure. The attack came at dawn on their third day in the cave rifle fire from multiple directions designed to pin them down, while Jonas maneuvered for a killing shot. Tokala fought with all the skill and cunning of his warrior heritage, using every feature of the rocky terrain to his advantage, while making each precious cartridge count toward their survival. But his wounded leg slowed his movements, and the overwhelming numerical odds gradually began to tell against them. A bullet creased his scalp, sending blood streaming down his face and momentarily stunning him. In that instant of vulnerability, Jonas Riggs himself appeared from behind a boulder, his rifle trained on Clara's small form. "End of the trail, little rabbit," Jonas said with obvious satisfaction. "You've caused me more trouble than any 10 men, but that's all finished now." Tokala tried to rise to interpose his own body between Clara and certain death, but his injuries had finally overwhelmed his iron will. He collapsed beside their meager fire consciousness, fading as blood loss and exhaustion claimed their toll. Jonas bound Clara's hands with rawhide strips and confiscated the journal, handling it like the valuable commodity it represented. "My brother's been mighty anxious to have a conversation with you, girl. Mighty anxious indeed." He loaded her onto his horse and spurred toward Red Knife Mine, leaving Tokala for dead among the rocks where ravens would soon strip his bones clean. Clara's last sight of her protector was his motionless form lying crumpled beside the cold ashes of their fire, and she felt something die inside her own heart at the apparent loss of the only person who had shown her genuine kindness since her parents' deaths. But appearances can be deceiving, especially when they concern old warriors who have survived decades of warfare and hardship through sheer stubbornness and refusal to surrender. Consciousness returned to Tokala, slowly bringing with it waves of agony from his various wounds and the bitter knowledge that he had failed in his primary obligation to protect the child who had trusted him. His ribs were cracked, his head split, and bleeding, his wounded leg nearly useless. But the image of his son's face, combined with the memory of Clara's courage and trust, drove him to struggle upright, despite injuries that would have kept most men prostrate for weeks. Using his rifle as a makeshift crutch, Clara began the agonizing journey toward Red Knife Mine. Each step was torture, each breath brought fresh waves of pain, but he pressed forward with the single-minded determination of a man who had found his final purpose in life. Meanwhile, Deputy Crane's investigation into the mining company's activities had finally begun to bear fruit. His search of Calvin Riggs' office while the man was away had uncovered a lockbox containing payroll records that proved beyond doubt that several accidental deaths were actually carefully planned murders designed to silence potential witnesses. His cousin Patrick's name was prominently featured on these death lists, along with Thomas Whitmore and dozens of other men whose only crime had been asking inconvenient questions about safety violations and missing workers. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Calvin Riggs was operating a criminal organization that used murder as a routine business practice. The discovery shattered Crane's remaining illusions about the men he had been serving either willingly or through cowardice. He began gathering a group of townspeople who had lost friends and relatives to mining accidents, showing them the documentary evidence and asking for their help in bringing the Riggs brothers to justice. Mary Halstead was among the first to volunteer, bringing with her additional evidence that would prove crucial in the trials to come. Letters from Thomas Whitmore that detailed his growing fear for his family's safety and his determination to expose the truth regardless of personal cost. "We may be too late to save Clara," Mary said with tears in her eyes, "but we can make sure her sacrifice wasn't meaningless." The posse that finally rode toward Red Knife Mine consisted of 15 determined men and women who had finally found the courage to stand up against the corruption that had poisoned their community for years. They were not professional lawmen or experienced fighters, but they possessed something equally valuable: the righteous anger of ordinary people who had endured injustice for too long. In the suffocating darkness of a storage shed at the Red Knife Mine compound, Clara sat with her hands bound behind her back, listening to the industrial sounds of an operation that had claimed so many innocent lives. Steam hissed from various pipes and machinery, while the constant rumble of ore carts and the shouts of workers created a hellish symphony that never ceased. Calvin Riggs entered the shed, carrying a coal oil lamp and her father's journal, his scarred face split by a satisfied smile that held no warmth whatsoever. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-chested, with the kind of physical presence that had probably served him well during his military service. "Miss Clara Whitmore," he said with mock formality, "I've been looking forward to making your acquaintance ever since you started causing problems for my business operations. You murdered my father." Clara replied with remarkable steadiness for an 8-year-old child facing her family's killer. "Your father was a persistent man." Calvin acknowledged, settling himself on a wooden crate with the journal spread across his knees. "Persistent and ultimately foolish. Just like you, it seems." He began reading selected passages aloud, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing weather or crop conditions rather than systematic murder and corruption. September 15th, 1877. Observed Jonas Riggs disposing of blood-stained mining equipment in Shaft 7. Equipment appeared to have been used as weapons rather than tools. "Your father had quite an eye for detail, didn't he?" Clara remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only provide him with additional ammunition to use against her and anyone else who might be working to expose his crimes. Calvin continued his recitation, clearly enjoying the psychological torture he was inflicting. October 1st, 1877. Witnessed arrival of 6 native prisoners, all bearing fresh wounds consistent with recent capture. These men have no legal existence officially. They died in battle weeks ago. He looked up from the journal with genuine amusement dancing in his cold eyes. You know that was one of my more brilliant innovations. Why pay wages to miners when the government provides free labor in the form of prisoners who are already officially dead, much more efficient than traditional business models? The casual way he discussed using human beings as disposable resources made Clara's stomach turn with revulsion. But she forced herself to remain calm and alert for any opportunity to escape. Ah, here's an interesting passage. Calvin continued flipping through the damaged pages. The young warrior they call Mapia shows natural leadership among the prisoners. He has been organizing them to resist the worst abuses, sharing what little food they can obtain, and maintaining their spiritual practices despite prohibition. Something in his tone suggested this particular name held special significance. And Clara found herself listening more intently as he read. Your father was quite taken with this particular Indian's courage and defiance. Devoted several pages to documenting his attempts to organize the other prisoners, his refusal to be broken by the conditions we imposed, his determination to maintain their savage dignity even in the face of inevitable death. Calvin's voice took on a distinctly cruel edge as he continued. Jonas took particular pleasure in dealing with that one. Beat him to death with a mining pick over the course of several hours, making sure the other prisoners watched every moment. Quite educational, really. We had very few disciplinary problems after that demonstration. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized the significance of what she was hearing. Mahpia, the name that had caused such a profound reaction in Tokala when Patrick Murphy mentioned it. This wasn't just any victim of Calvin's brutality. This was someone important, someone whose death would mean more than just another casualty in an ongoing war between good and evil. You enjoyed it? She said quietly, unable to keep the accusation from escaping her lips. I enjoyed the results, Calvin corrected. Business improved considerably once the workforce understood the consequences of resistance. Fear is an excellent motivator when properly applied. He closed the journal and leaned forward, his face coming closer to hers in the lamplight. Now then, Miss Whitmore, let's discuss what other evidence might exist beyond your father's careful notes. Did he share his discoveries with anyone else? Hide additional documents somewhere. Send letters to authorities outside my sphere of influence. Clara met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from her father's memory, and the knowledge that Tokala, if he was still alive, would come for her, regardless of his own injuries. He shared everything with people who will make sure the truth comes out, no matter what happens to me. Calvin's expression darkened at this defiant response. We'll see about that, won't we? He departed, leaving Clara alone in the darkness to contemplate the terrible knowledge she had gained. Tokala's son, the young warrior, whose courage had inspired her father to document Calvin's crimes, had died under this man's direct orders, murdered in the most brutal fashion imaginable as an example to other prisoners. The personal nature of Tokala's quest for justice now made perfect sense. He wasn't just helping a random orphaned child seek legal redress for her father's death. He was pursuing the man who had ordered his own son's torture and murder. The warrior's calm exterior masked a grief and rage that went deeper than Clara could fully comprehend. Hours passed in the stifling shed. Before she heard the sound she had been hoping for, the soft whisper of moccasins on gravel, barely audible above the industrial noise of the mining operation. A shadow moved past the single small window, and Clara felt her heart leap with desperate hope. Tokala, she whispered as quietly as possible. A familiar voice responded from just outside the shed wall. I am here, little fox. Are you injured? Just scared, she replied honestly. But Tokala, Calvin has been reading Papa's journal. He told me things about your son, about how he died. Terrible things. There was a long silence before Tokala responded, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Calvin Riggs will answer for what he has done. Tonight, little one. Tonight the debts of blood will be paid in full. Clara heard him moving away from the shed, beginning whatever plan he had devised for their rescue and his revenge. She settled back to wait, knowing that before this night was over, either justice would finally be served, or both she and her protector would join her parents and his son in whatever realm awaited those who died fighting for what was right. The sound of approaching footsteps warned her that Calvin was returning, probably accompanied by Jonas and whatever other murderers they employed to maintain their grip on this corner of Wyoming territory. The final confrontation was about to begin. The Red Knife mine complex erupted into chaos as Tokala's one-man war began, with the precision of a military operation planned by someone who understood both strategy and his enemy's weaknesses. Despite his injuries, the old warrior moved through the industrial maze like a vengeful spirit, using shadows and steam clouds for concealment, while systematically eliminating sentries and guards. Clara heard the first gunshot from her prison in the storage shed, followed quickly by shouts of alarm and the sound of running feet as Calvin's men responded to the unexpected attack. Through the small window, she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness, while the mining operation's normal sounds gave way to the din of combat. What the hell is happening out there? Jonas Riggs' voice carried clearly through the night air as he emerged from the main office building with a rifle in his hands. "Indians come for the girl," one of his men shouted back. Took out Murphy and Davis, already moving like a damn ghost. Calvin appeared moments later, his face twisted with rage at this unexpected complication. "How many men are we dealing with?" "Just the one, far as we can tell," Jonas replied, working the lever of his rifle to chamber a fresh round. "But he's fighting like he's got nothing left to lose." "Or then we end this tonight," Calvin declared with cold finality. "Bring me that girl. If the Indian wants her so badly, we'll use her to draw him into the open where we can finish him properly." Jonas kicked open the shed door and hauled Clara out by her bound arms, his grip painful enough to leave bruises on her thin wrists. "Come on, little rabbit. Time to serve as bait in a trap." They dragged her toward the main mine shaft, where a wooden platform served as both loading dock and execution ground for those who had crossed Calvin Riggs in the past. Calvin positioned himself behind an overturned ore cart, while Jonas held Clara at the platform's edge, his pistol pressed against her temple. "Tokala," Calvin shouted into the darkness. "I know you're out there, old man. Come out where I can see you, or the girl dies right now." For several tense moments, nothing moved in the complex except drifting steam and the shadows cast by flickering torches. Then Tokala emerged from behind a pile of mining equipment, his rifle trained on Calvin's position, despite the impossible tactical situation. "Let her go," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground. "Your quarrel is with me." Calvin laughed, the sound echoing off the industrial structures with harsh mockery. "My quarrel is with anyone who interferes with my business operations. But I have to say, I'm impressed that you made it this far with those injuries. Most men would have died from blood loss hours ago." "I am not most men," Tokala replied simply. No, you're not," Calvin agreed. "You're the father of that troublesome Indian boy we had to discipline a few months back. What was his name again? Mapia?" Even in the uncertain light, Clara could see Tokala's reaction to hearing his son's name spoken so casually by his murderer. The old warrior's composure cracked, visibly revealing the grief and rage that burned beneath his stoic exterior. "My son died with honor." Tokala said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your son died screaming like a coward," Calvin replied with deliberate cruelty. "Begged Jonas to stop hitting him, promised to be good if we'd just let him live. Quite pathetic, really, for someone you people consider a warrior." It was a lie designed to provoke, but it struck home with devastating effect. Tokala's rifle wavered as anguish overwhelmed his training and experience, creating the opening that Jonas had been waiting for. The younger Riggs brother fired 3 quick shots, his bullet striking Tokala in the chest and shoulder and sending the old warrior sprawling behind a pile of timber. Clara screamed as she saw her protector fall, genuine terror flooding through her as she realized they were both about to die in this hellish place. But Tokala was not finished yet. With his dying strength, he pulled the pins from 2 dynamite sticks he had taken from the mine's supplies, hurling them toward the main support structures that held up the loading platform. "Get down!" he shouted to Clara in the seconds before the explosions lit up the night. The twin blasts brought down half the platform in a cascade of splintered wood and twisted metal, creating a chaos that allowed Clara to break free from Jonas's temporarily loosened grip. She rolled away from the collapsing structure as debris rained down around her, the sound of destruction drowning out everything else. When the smoke cleared, Jonas Riggs lay pinned beneath a massive beam, his leg clearly broken and his face pale with shock and pain. Calvin had been thrown clear of the blast, but was stunned and disoriented, his rifle lost somewhere in the rubble. Clara crawled toward Tokala's motionless form, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. The old warrior was still breathing, but blood frothed from his lips with each labored breath. And she could see that his injuries were beyond anything her limited medical knowledge could address. "Don't die," she whispered, taking his weathered hand in both of hers. "Please don't leave me alone." Tokala's eyes opened, focusing on her face with tremendous effort. "Listen to me, little fox," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your father's journal must reach honest authorities. Promise me." "I promise," Clara said through her tears. "Good." His grip tightened slightly on her hands. "My son, proud of you. Both our fathers. Proud." Those were the last coherent words he spoke. Clara sat beside him as his breathing grew shallower, and finally stopped her heart breaking for this brave man who had sacrificed everything to protect her and seek justice for his murdered child. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Deputy Crane's posse, but Clara barely noticed their shouts of alarm and concern. She remained kneeling beside Tokala's body, clutching her father's journal to her chest, while tears fell like rain on the blood-soaked ground of the Red Knife Mine. Justice had been served, but the price had been higher than anyone should have been asked to pay. Deputy Crane and his volunteer posse arrived at the Red Knife Mine to find the complex transformed into a battlefield, with smoke rising from damaged buildings and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the mountain air. The sound of groaning timber and settling debris created an ominous soundtrack as they dismounted and spread out to assess the situation. Clara looked up from Tokala's still form as the rescuers approached her young face, streaked with tears and soot, but her grip on the journal never wavering. Mary Halstead was among the first to reach her, dropping to her knees and gathering the child into a fierce embrace. "Thank God you're alive," Mary whispered, her own tears flowing freely as she held Clara against her chest. "We heard the explosions from miles away and feared we were too late." Crane quickly took charge of securing the scene, his deputies spreading out to round up surviving members of Calvin's organization, while he focused on the most immediate threat. Calvin Riggs himself sat among the rubble, dazed but conscious, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. "Calvin Riggs," Crane said formally, his service revolver trained on the mine owner's chest. "You're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and about a dozen other charges that'll see you hang before the year's out." Calvin's response was a bitter laugh that held no trace of defeat or remorse. "You think this changes anything, boy? You think arresting me will make any difference to how business is conducted in this territory?" "I think it's a good start," Crane replied steadily. Jonas Riggs proved more problematic. His injuries were severe enough to require immediate medical attention, but not so serious as to prevent him from making threats against everyone involved in his capture. As they prepared to transport him to town for treatment and eventual trial, he fixed Clara with a malevolent stare that promised future retribution. "Mom, this isn't over, girl," he snarled through gritted teeth. The Riggs family has a long memory for debts that need collecting. Clara met his gaze without flinching, her courage strengthened by the memory of everything Tokala had taught her about facing evil without showing fear. "Your family ends here," she said quietly. "There won't be any more Riggs causing pain in this territory." The evidence they recovered from the mine offices was overwhelming ledgers documenting fraudulent transactions, correspondence with corrupt officials, and most damning of all, detailed records of the native prisoners who had been worked to death in the deepest shafts. Thomas Whitmore's journal provided the narrative framework that tied all the documentary evidence together into a comprehensive case that no honest court could ignore. Mary Halstead finally revealed the secret she had been keeping since Clara's parents first arrived in Wyoming territory. "I should have told you this long ago," she said as they prepared to leave the mine complex. "Thomas was my brother, not just a friend I helped out of kindness. These letters he sent me prove that Calvin personally murdered him rather than simply arranging a mining accident." She produced a bundle of correspondence from her saddlebag letters that provided crucial corroborating evidence for the journal's accusations and established a clear pattern of premeditated murder designed to silence potential witnesses. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Clara asked, her voice showing more curiosity than accusation. "Because I was afraid," Mary admitted honestly. "Afraid of Calvin's power, afraid of what would happen if I spoke up, afraid of losing you the way I'd already lost Thomas. But watching you and Tokala fight for justice showed me that some things are worth any risk." As they loaded Tokala's body onto a wagon for the journey back to town, Clara noticed something clutched in his lifeless hand, a small beaded object that had somehow survived the battle. Deputy Crane gently pried the old warrior's fingers open to reveal a bracelet worked in traditional Lakota patterns, its colors still bright despite the blood and smoke that had surrounded its final moments. "This probably belonged to his son," Crane said softly. "He must have been carrying it all this time, hoping to find out what happened to the boy." Clara took the bracelet with reverent care, understanding that it represented not just a father's love, but a connection between the living and the dead that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. She would ensure that it was buried with Tokala according to the traditions of his people. The journey back to Crow's Landing took most of the night, their small caravan moving slowly through mountain passes, while the prisoners complained about their treatment and the wounded groaned with each jolt of the wagons. Clara rode with Mary, her head resting against her newfound aunt's shoulder, while she processed everything that had happened since that terrible evening. When Jonas Riggs had first appeared at her family's homestead, as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, they finally reached the settlement where so much of their story had unfolded. Word of the night's events had somehow preceded them, and a crowd had gathered in the main street to witness the end of Calvin Riggs's reign of terror. The trials that followed would be remembered throughout Wyoming territory and beyond as a watershed moment when ordinary citizens finally found the courage to stand up against organized corruption. Calvin Riggs was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to hang, while Jonas received life imprisonment due to his injuries and willingness to testify against his deceased accomplices in exchange for avoiding the gallows. Dozens of corrupt officials were removed from office or fled the territory rather than face prosecution, while new laws were enacted to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had characterized the Red Knife Mine's operations. The territorial legislature also established funds to compensate the families of victims and to provide better oversight of mining safety practices. Deputy Crane was promoted to sheriff, his conscience finally clear after years of compromise and moral uncertainty. His first official act was to ensure that Tokala received a proper burial, according to Lakota traditions, with representatives from his tribe, traveling hundreds of miles to honor the warrior who had died protecting a white child and seeking justice for all victims of oppression. Clara was formally adopted by Mary Halstead, gaining not just a guardian, but a loving family member who understood her loss and was committed to helping her heal from the trauma she had endured. The boarding house in Crow's Landing became her true home, filled with the warmth and stability she needed to grow from a traumatized orphan into a strong and compassionate young woman. 3 months after the battle at Red Knife Mine, Clara stood in the cemetery behind Crow's Landing's small church, placing wildflowers on the grave, where Tokala had been laid to rest according to the traditions of his people. The marker bore his name in both English and Lakota script, along with a simple inscription, "He died protecting the innocent." Mary Halstead stood beside her, watching with gentle eyes as Clara performed this weekly ritual that had become as important to her as Sunday services were to the church-going members of their community. The child had grown visibly in the months since their ordeal, not just in height and weight, as proper nutrition took effect, but in confidence and maturity that spoke of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and emerged stronger for the experience. "Do you think he can hear us?" Clara asked, kneeling to arrange the flowers in the small vase she had placed beside the headstone. "I think the people we love never truly leave us," Mary replied carefully. "They live on in our memories and in the things we do to honor their memory." Sheriff Crane approached from the church, his new badge gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The promotion had aged him. In some ways, the weight of real responsibility was heavier than the casual corruption he had previously accepted, but it had also given him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. "Afternoon, ladies," he said respectfully, removing his hat as he joined them beside Tokala's grave. "Thought you'd want to know that the last of Calvin's accomplices was sentenced this morning. Judge Hawthorne gave him 20 years in territorial prison." "Good," Clara said simply. She had testified at several of the trials, her clear recollections and unshakable composure on the witness stand, helping to secure convictions that might otherwise have been difficult to obtain. "What about the mine?" "Closed permanently by order of the territorial government," Crane reported. "The shafts have been sealed, and the land's been set aside as a memorial to everyone who died there. There's talk of building a school on part of the property funded by money recovered from Calvin's fraudulent schemes." This news brought a smile to Clara's face. The idea that something positive and life-affirming could grow from the sight of so much suffering appealed to her sense of justice and her belief in redemption through righteous action. "The Clara Whitmore School for Displaced Children," Mary said thoughtfully. "It has a nice ring to it. I don't need a school named after me." Clara protested, though she was obviously pleased by the suggestion. "Maybe not," Crane agreed. "But other children who find themselves alone in the world might benefit from having a place where people understand what they've been through and can help them build new lives." As they walked back toward town, Clara found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible night when she had first met Tokala among the ruins of her family's homestead. The journal that had started their journey was now part of the official court record, its pages carefully preserved as evidence that would ensure the true story of the Red Knife Mine would never be forgotten or distorted by those who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Patrick Murphy had eventually surfaced his testimony, helping to fill in gaps left by the damaged pages of Thomas's journal. He had been given a new identity and relocated to California, where he was working to establish safety regulations for mining operations throughout the West. The boarding house had prospered under Mary's management, with several of the rooms now permanently occupied by territorial officials who had been sent to oversee the cleanup of corruption in the area. Clara had her own room filled with books and the few possessions she had managed to salvage from her family's destroyed homestead. Most precious among these items was a small wooden box that contained Mahapia's beaded bracelet, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, and accompanied by a letter Clara had written to Tokala's son, telling him about his father's courage and love. She had never shown the letter to anyone else, but writing it had helped her process her own grief and find peace with the losses they had all endured. As evening approached and the mountain peaks turned purple in the fading light, Clara sat at her bedroom window and looked out toward the distant hills where she knew other children might be facing dangers and hardships similar to what she had experienced. Someday, when she was older and stronger, she would find ways to help them just as Tokala had helped her when she needed it most. The past could not be changed, but the future remained unwritten, full of possibilities for justice, compassion, and the kind of courage that made ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. 1 year after the destruction of the Red Knife Mine, Clara stood once again at the fence post where her incredible journey had begun. The Whitmore homestead had been rebuilt with money from Calvin Riggs' seized assets, but Clara had asked that this particular spot remain untouched as a memorial to her father and the truth he had died to preserve. Mary knelt beside her in the autumn grass, helping to plant the wildflower seeds that would bloom next spring in memory of all those who had perished in Calvin's reign of terror. The past year had been filled with healing and growth for both of them, as Clara learned to be a child again, while Mary discovered the joys and challenges of motherhood. "Do you ever miss the excitement?" Mary asked with gentle teasing in her voice. "I miss Tokala," Clara replied honestly. "I miss knowing that there was someone so brave and strong looking after me. But I don't miss being afraid all the time, or not knowing where my next meal was coming from." Sheriff Crane approached on horseback, his uniform showing the dust and wear of a long day's patrol through the territory that had become his responsibility. The intervening months had been good to him. Regular meals and the satisfaction of honest work had filled out his frame and given him the confidence that comes with earned respect. "Ladies," he said, dismounting and approaching them with something resembling ceremony in his bearing, "I have something that belongs to you, Clara. Something we finally recovered from the mine ruins." From his saddlebag, he withdrew a small leather pouch that Clara recognized immediately. It was identical to the one she had used to carry her father's journal during their desperate flight across the Wyoming wilderness. "We found this in the deepest part of the mine, in a section that was sealed after the collapse," Crane explained. "Took us months to dig down that far, but we wanted to recover the remains of the prisoners who died there so they could be given proper burial." Clara opened the pouch with trembling fingers and gasped at what she found inside another beaded bracelet. This one, even more beautiful than the first, worked with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story of love and hope, despite the terrible circumstances of its creation. "And this belonged to Mahpia," she whispered, recognizing the craftsmanship that matched the bracelet Tokala had carried. "He must have hidden it before they killed him." "There was something else," Crane said gently. "A message carved into the rock wall near where we found the bracelet. Written in English, probably so that someone like your father could read it if they ever discovered it." He handed her a piece of paper with a careful transcription of the message. "My name is Mahpia, son of Tokala of the Oglala band. I die far from home, but I die with honor, protecting my brothers. Tell my father that his son remembered the warrior's path until the end." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she read these final words from the young man whose courage had inspired her father to document Calvin's crimes and whose memory had driven Tokala to sacrifice his life for justice. The message created a connection across time and death, proving that love and honor could survive even in the darkest circumstances. "He knew," Clara said softly. Somehow, Mahpia knew that his father would come looking for him, and he wanted to make sure Tokala would know that his son died as a warrior. Mary embraced Clara as she wept for all the losses they had endured, her parents, Tokala, Mahpia, and all the other innocent victims of Calvin Riggs's brutality. But these were not tears of despair. They were tears of completion, of finally understanding the full story that had shaped all their lives. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of keeping Mahpia's bracelet as a treasured memento, She carefully placed it in the earth beside the fence post, exactly where she and Tokala had first dug up her father's journal. "Now they're all together," she said, placing her small hand flat against the soil. Papa and Mapia and Tokala watching over them both. Their story's been told, their murders have been avenged, and people will remember what they died for. As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared on the horizon. An elderly Lakota woman riding a painted horse, her gray hair braided with eagle feathers, and her weathered face bearing the dignity of one who had survived the destruction of an entire way of life. She dismounted near the fence post and approached them with the careful courtesy of someone entering sacred ground. When she spoke, her English was accented but clear. "I am Winona, grandmother of Mahpia, mother of the woman who was wife to Tokala," she said formally. "I have come to honor the memory of my grandson and the warrior who died seeking justice for him." Clara rose to meet her, instinctively understanding that this moment was important beyond her ability to fully comprehend. "I'm Clara. I was with Tokala when he found out what happened to Mapia. He loved his son very much." Winona nodded gravely, then knelt beside the fence post and placed her own hand on the earth where Clara had buried the bracelet. She spoke in Lakota for several minutes, her voice carrying the rhythm of prayer or ceremonial blessing. When she finished, she looked at Clara with eyes that held both sadness and approval. "You are adopted into our family, child. You are sister to Mahpia, daughter to Tokala, granddaughter to me. This is the way of our people. Those who honor our dead become part of our circle." The formal adoption ceremony that followed would be remembered in both communities as a moment when old wounds began to heal and understanding grew between peoples who had been enemies for too long. Clara learned her Lakota name, Washte Wingyang, meaning good woman, and was presented with gifts that symbolized her acceptance into a family that transcended the boundaries of blood and race. Years later, when Clara had grown into a teacher and advocate for workers' rights throughout the American West, she would tell the story of the brave Lakota warrior who had helped her dig up the truth that powerful men wanted to keep buried. The tale became legend throughout Wyoming territory, and beyond a reminder that courage could be found in the most unexpected places, and that justice, however long delayed, would eventually find its way to the light. But on this particular evening, as autumn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara was simply a child who had finally found her place in the world, surrounded by family both old and new, standing on ground made sacred by the blood of those who had died for truth and justice. The circle was complete. The truth had been told. And in a harsh land where survival often seemed to depend on hardness and selfishness, love and honor had proven stronger than greed and violence.